The gavel slammed down, echoing through the tense courtroom. "Miss Bondi, you are fined $10,000, the judge declared, his tone firm and final. A murmur swept through the spectators. Pam Bondi, the seasoned attorney, had just been penalized in what seemed like an open and shut case. But as she calmly adjusted her papers and stepped forward, a knowing smile played at the corner of her lips. She wasn't done yet. "Your Honor," she began smoothly, "I believe there's something you might have overlooked." And in that moment, no one realized they were about to witness one of the greatest legal turnarounds in courtroom history. The courtroom was silent, except for the steady tapping of the judge's pen against his desk. A row of attorneys sat rigidly, their eyes flickering between the prosecution and the defense. At the center of it all stood Pam Bondi, her posture firm, her expression unreadable. The case had been dragging on for weeks, and now, at long last, the judge was ready to deliver his verdict. Clearing his throat, the judge adjusted his glasses and looked directly at Pam. "Ms. Bondi, after careful consideration of the facts, I find that your argument lacks sufficient legal grounds. As a result, the court imposes a fine of $10,000 for improper representation and misinterpretation of the law." A wave of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Reporters whispered to one another, their pens scratching furiously against their notepads. The prosecution exchanged glances, barely concealing their smirks. This was supposed to be a battle of wits, and it appeared that Pam Bondi had just lost. But unlike the others in the room, Pam didn't flinch. She didn't protest. She didn't even let out a sigh of frustration. Instead, she merely tilted her head slightly, as if considering the judge's words with great interest. The moment stretched long enough for the murmurs to die down, for the air to become thick with anticipation. She calmly reached for her papers, sifting through them with a precision that suggested she already knew exactly what she was looking for. The judge watched, his patience thinning. "Ms. Bondi, if you have something to say it now." A small smile played at the corner of her lips. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, lifting her gaze, "I believe there's a crucial detail that has been overlooked." The courtroom remained still, the weight of the judge's ruling pressing down on everyone present. But Pam Bondi showed no sign of distress. She adjusted the stack of legal documents in front of her, her fingers gliding over the pages with practiced ease. The prosecution, seated confidently at their table, exchanged quick glances, silently celebrating their apparent victory. Pam took a deep breath and stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. Every movement was deliberate, every second stretched as anticipation built. "Your Honor," she began, her voice calm but firm, "I respectfully request the court's permission to present a clarification regarding the ruling." The judge, who had already begun to shift his focus to the next order of business, narrowed his eyes. "Ms. Bondi, I've made my decision. If you wish to appeal, you may do so through the proper channels." Pam nodded, completely unfazed. "Of course, Your Honor, but I believe the proper channel is right here, right now." She picked up a document, holding it carefully between her fingers. "This ruling was made under the assumption that my interpretation of the law was incorrect. However, I would like to direct the court's attention to a precedent set in a similar case, one that changes the entire framework of this discussion." The judge raised an eyebrow, but gestured for her to continue. The room, which had just minutes ago been buzzing with murmurs of her defeat, was now silent once again, drawn in by the unexpected turn. Pam took her time flipping through her documents before stopping at a highlighted section. In the case of Reynolds v. State, the appellate court ruled that the legal principle in question was not only subject to broader interpretation, but that failure to consider its full scope could lead to a fundamentally flawed ruling. She glanced up, meeting the judge's gaze directly. "This means that the fine imposed on me is based on an incomplete application of the law." A few gasps sounded from the spectators. The prosecution's confidence wavered, their once smug expressions now tight with unease. The judge, who had begun the day expecting a routine session, now leaned forward slightly, intrigued despite himself. He folded his hands together, his previous certainty shaken. "That is a bold claim, Ms. Bondi," he said slowly. "Are you implying that this court has erred in its decision?" Pam held his gaze steadily. "Not at all, Your Honor. I'm simply saying that even the most well-intentioned rulings can be subject to new interpretations when all the facts are considered." She let the words hang in the air, waiting. For the first time since the session began, the balance of power in the courtroom shifted. The judge's fingers drummed lightly against the wooden bench as he considered Pam Bondi's words. The air in the courtroom was heavy, charged with the tension of an unexpected shift. A few moments ago, it had seemed like a straightforward ruling, one that had put an end to the matter. But now, uncertainty flickered in the judge's eyes as he reached for his own notes. Pam stood her ground, her expression composed but sharp, watching as the judge flipped through pages of legal precedents. His brow furrowed as he traced over passages, his mind working quickly to connect the dots. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Just minutes ago, they had been reveling in their apparent victory, but now the confidence was draining from their faces. The lead prosecutor, a seasoned lawyer in his own right, leaned in toward his team, whispering furiously. Pam, sensing the tide turning, remained poised. She knew that this moment, the judge's realization, was crucial. Finally, after several long seconds, the judge let out a slow breath and set his papers down. His expression was no longer stern but contemplative. He adjusted his glasses and looked at Pam with newfound interest. "This precedent you cited," he said, his voice measured, "does indeed suggest a broader interpretation of the law in cases such as this. And if I'm not mistaken—" He trailed off, scanning his notes again before nodding to himself. "Yes, this does create an important legal distinction that may have been overlooked in my initial ruling." A hushed wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. The spectators, who had been waiting to see Pam accept defeat, were now watching the unexpected unfold before them. Even the reporters at the back scrambled to scribble down the latest development. The judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on Pam. "Ms. Bondi," he said, tapping his fingers on the bench, "are you suggesting that this court reconsider its ruling?" Pam met his gaze without hesitation. "Your Honor, I'm suggesting that justice demands it." The words hung in the air, firm and unwavering. The judge exhaled, rubbing his chin in thought. It was clear that he hadn't expected to be challenged so effectively, and yet he couldn't deny the strength of Pam's argument. The prosecution lawyer finally spoke up, his voice forced and formal. "Your Honor, if I may—" The judge raised a hand, silencing him. "I'll hear arguments in a moment. Right now I need to fully review this case in light of this new perspective." The prosecutor sat back, clearly irritated, while Pam remained calm, knowing full well that she had planted a seed of doubt in the judge's mind. And once a judge starts second-guessing their own ruling, the case is far from over. The courtroom had transformed. Just moments ago, it was a place of quiet certainty where the judge's ruling had seemed absolute. But now, an unmistakable shift had taken place. The judge sat back in his chair, eyes flicking between the legal text before him and Pam Bondi, who stood motionless, her face calm but unwavering. The prosecution team, who had been on the verge of victory, no longer looked so sure of themselves. The lead prosecutor sat rigidly, his jaw tightening as he glanced over at his colleagues. One of them hurriedly flipped through their own case notes, but it was clear they hadn't anticipated this challenge. Pam, however, had. The judge let out a slow breath and tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Then, finally, he reached for his gavel, but hesitated before bringing it down. His next words carried a weight that was unmistakable. Ms. Bondi, he began, his voice steady but thoughtful, this court has reviewed your argument carefully, and I must admit— He paused, his gaze settling on her with something that resembled reluctant admiration. It holds merit. A wave of murmurs swept across the courtroom. Reporters at the back scrambled to capture the moment, their pens flying over their notepads. The prosecutor clenched his jaw, his hands tightening into fists beneath the table. Pam didn't move, but her expression subtly shifted, the smallest hint of satisfaction flickering across her face. She had known all along that the law was on her side. The judge continued, flipping through the pages before him. The precedent you cited, Reynolds v. State, clearly demonstrates that similar cases have been misjudged due to a lack of full legal interpretation. And in light of that, it appears that my initial ruling was indeed premature. Another round of whispers surged through the courtroom. The tension was thick enough to be cut with a knife. The judge turned to the prosecution. Do you have any counter-arguments to present? The lead prosecutor hesitated for a split second before rising to his feet. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the case Ms. Bondi has cited, we maintain that her interpretation stretches beyond what the law originally intended. He turned to Pam, his voice sharpening. She's taking liberties with a precedent that was never meant to apply in this manner. Pam smiled, a knowing glint in her eye. With all due respect, Counselor, the law is built on interpretation, and the moment we stop questioning it, we stop seeking justice. The judge exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. Then with a slow, deliberate nod, he lifted his gavel. After careful review, I find that the fine imposed on Ms. Bondi must be reconsidered. The ruling is overturned. A stunned silence filled the room before a few gasps escaped from the gallery. The reporters, sensing the moment's importance, practically lunged for their keyboards. The prosecution stood frozen, their momentum shattered in an instant. Pam Bondi, however, remained composed. She had never doubted this outcome. She simply gathered her papers, adjusted her stance, and gave the judge a respectful nod. The balance of power had shifted completely. The judge's gavel hovered over the bench for a brief moment before striking down with a decisive thud. The sound echoed through the courtroom, sealing Pam Bondi's unexpected victory. A hush fell over the room as everyone processed what had just happened. The prosecution, moments ago so confident, sat stiffly, their expressions blank with disbelief. Pam, on the other hand, remained poised. She gathered her papers slowly, deliberately, as if she had known all along that this would be the outcome. The judge, still rubbing his chin in thought, let out a small, almost amused sigh. He had presided over hundreds of cases in his career, but rarely had he seen a turnaround like this. "Ms. Bondi," he said at last, his voice carrying a mix of authority and reluctant admiration. "I must admit, I did not expect to reverse my decision today, but I cannot ignore the clarity and precision of your legal argument. Your ability to navigate case law and present such a compelling interpretation is impressive." The room was dead silent, everyone waiting to see how Pam would respond, but she simply offered a polite, professional nod. "Thank you, Your Honor. My only goal was to ensure the law was applied fairly." The judge smirked slightly, as if seeing right through her humility. "You don't just ensure the law is applied fairly, Ms. Bondi. You shape how it's interpreted." He leaned forward, his gaze sharp. "It's rare to see someone argue a case with such confidence, and even rarer to see a ruling overturned in real time. You've demonstrated an exceptional understanding of the law." A murmur ran through the spectators. The reporters, sensing the weight of the moment, wrote furiously, some already composing their headlines. "Pam Bondi outwits the court in stunning legal victory." The lead prosecutor, clearly still processing his loss, let out a quiet breath before finally turning to Pam. "I'll admit, that was impressive." His words were measured, but there was a begrudging respect in his tone. "You played the long game, and you won." Pam tilted her head slightly, offering the faintest smile. It was never about winning, just about getting it right. The judge tapped his fingers on the bench before sitting back with a knowing expression. "Well, Ms. Bondi, I suspect this won't be the last time we see your name attached to a landmark case." He gave a nod before gathering his papers. "Court is adjourned." The gavel struck the bench one final time, and just like that it was over. But the impact of what had happened in that courtroom would linger far beyond the walls of the courthouse. Pam Bondi had done more than just win. She had proven herself a legal force to be reckoned with.